Welcome back to my channel, A Critic's Take. Today, I wish to draw my viewers' attention towards an apparently insignificant, yet very much thought-provoking and sensitive news headline. It says, almost half of Australian PhD students considering disengaging from studies due to pandemic. Now, I am troubled to have this idea in my mind that the popular saying, blame it on Rio, might soon be rephrased as blame it on COVID. Should really the pandemic be accountable for the crisis in higher education and the hardship faced by the PhD scholars? Today, a Critic's Take channel would explore the story behind this headline. But to begin with, let's first get the brief of the news. On 9th of July, The Guardian has published news with reference to a study from the University of Sydney. The study collected response from more than 1,000 current PhD students. 45% of them said that they expected to disengage from their studies, which include suspending a PhD or dropping out entirely with the next 6 months. The Guardian marked this development as the economic impact of COVID-19 and explained it as a threat to empty out Australia's talent pool of researchers. According to the study, 5% of the PhD scholars might experience homelessness and 11% were skipping meals. 75% of them experienced financial hardship, while almost 20% were unable to pay bills or buy medicines. The study's lead author, Rebecca Johnson, reminded, as if we were back to the old days when the wealthy people got PhDs and the people of lower economic status just dropped out. Johnson, who herself is a PhD student at the University of Sydney's Faculty of Medicine, described this as the gentrification of PhD and said that her colleagues were commonly under financial stress, but it was rarely discussed. Thus, in her paper, she termed it as the quiet crisis. And the quiet crisis is not just the fallout of COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, the crisis in education sector arrived much before the COVID-19. The crisis worsened following the freezing of research funding and PhD scholarships. We could know this from an article which is still available with the website known as Universities Australia. This article was published on 19th December 2018, that is 2 years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the article, Australia's government decided to cut research funding, for which the regional universities had the hardest hit since 2017. In the year 2018, it was predicted that the hit would be felt the most in 2020 in compared to the previous years. The damage would be much longer in inventions, ideas, and opportunities. Long before the COVID-19 pandemic, the university leaders knew that the research funding along with the jobs for researchers were at stake. Therefore, today's financial hardship faced by the PhD students in Australia is not due to the COVID pandemic. And what about the other parts of the world? Let us go through the Nature's research published on 13th November 2019. Again, 2 months prior to the arrival of COVID. This study was conducted with more than 6,200 graduate students, and the study revealed the torturous truth of doctoral research. The said article, published in the Nature, begins with a story of a chemistry student whose name is Marina Kovacic, who started her PhD program with no funding. So she had to start bartending and waitressing. Can you believe that a research scholar waited on tables and served drinks in between her experiments because she didn't have funds? 2 years later, when she was funded in another laboratory, she had to abruptly switch her research from medicinal chemistry to computational chemistry. Let me remind you again, this was the fate of many PhD scholars across the world, and it was much before the COVID-19 struck. Back home, what's the situation in India? On 29th of January 2018, the Economic Times informed us that India's R&D spend was stagnant for the consecutive 20 years. Referring to the Economic Survey report of the Government of India, the Economic Times reported that India's spending on R&D in terms of GDP had been stagnant at 0.6 to 0.7% in the last 2 decades, which is well below than that of the United States of America and China. Even today, such meager spending in R&D is quite contrary to the Prime Minister's Make in India slogan. The Economic Survey 2017-2018 recommended that India should redouble its efforts to make improvements in science and R&D. However, things have not yet been improved. Not only for the research and PhD scholars, worldwide, funding pressure have been a big issue for education systems. The BBC News published an article on 30th January 2019 which discussed about 10 global megatrends that were going to affect education system around the world. On the issue of funding, education system, the article 1 year before the arrival of COVID-19 raised 2 questions. Who should pay more for students going to the universities? Number 1. And number 2, what happens when funding levels have to be cut? Now, under the pretext of COVID-19 pandemic, attempts are being made to avoid these important questions and their solutions. The BBC News in that article also discussed about the wealth gap versus social mobility. The article recognized the fact that the gap between the richest and the poorest was widening and threw another important question: how could such economic inequality be balanced to offer fair access to opportunity? No answer is available as yet. The COVID-19 pandemic is further widening the gap between the rich and the poor. The economic mismanagement, which started much before the pandemic, is still being practiced, and that is creating havoc for the education system. And now everything is being done under the veil of COVID-19. But this must be stopped. The policymakers throughout the world must overhaul the policies of economic liberalization. They should not try to overcome the economic crisis created by them with the help of COVID-19. There should be more public spending on education to protect the next generation of researchers. Let me request you to mobilize the mass opinion in favor of this. The people whom we expect to develop a vaccine for us, to remodel our economy, or to rebuild our infrastructure should have enough food to eat or to put a roof over their heads.